Hello there, welcome to the Comments, a collaborative project by Espreso.Global and Ukrainian media. I'm Elena Solodovnikova, and it's a great pleasure for me to be joined by Anton Shekhovtsov, director of the Center for Democratic Integrity. Anton, after the all elections of European Parliament, the right-wing parties have significantly improved their positions. Representatives of MP, of course. First of all, how do you explain this choice of Europeans? And secondly, what impact will this have on the problems of migration and refugees, in particular on those from Ukraine?
Well, first of all, hello, Elena. Thank you for having me. Yes, indeed, there has been a slight right-wing turn at these elections to the European Parliament. Although I can't say that some catastrophe has happened. There has been no catastrophe. The mainstream parties, the center-right and center-left-wing parties, they will still form the core at the European Parliament with the majority, with the help of the Liberals, also probably with the help of the reformists and conservatives. But yes, some of the parties, especially in Germany, France, and Austria, there has been this rise of the hard right, as sometimes they're called, or far right. Just a subjective preference how to call them. And the reasons for this right-wing turn is that, well, first, the ongoing migration crisis. So it's not only about refugees, but still Europe is attracting a lot of migrants, especially from African countries and the Middle East. This is, for some countries, this is quite unnerving, the numbers of the people who are arriving, but also the speed with which these processes happen. So it's not only the numbers, but also the speed, the pace of the developments. And also the far right, the hard right, they have been strengthened during the pandemic, because in some countries, especially Germany and Austria, I would say, there was opposition to the measures against COVID-19 pandemic taken by the centrist forces. So this opposition, it was somehow translated into the support for the far right. And the third reason, so first the migration, the ongoing, I would say, ongoing migration crisis. Second, the pandemic, and third, the inflation that followed the pandemic. So I think these three reasons, they underpin what's going on today. And there is also this general factor, which is about the loss of trust. Not complete loss of trust, but a significant amount of loss of trust towards the centrist forces, towards the mainstream, the establishment, so-called establishment. So this is these are the reasons. I don't think, however, that this will somehow influence the situation with Ukrainian refugees in Europe. There is a consensus, and it's quite a strong one, that Ukrainian refugees need protection, need support. Sometimes there are voices, like we've heard recently from one conservative politician in Germany, who said that those Ukrainian refugees who have no job, they need to be sent back to safer regions of Ukraine. But that was criticized quite heavily by other politicians, even from his own party in Germany. So I don't think that this will somehow influence the situation with Ukrainian refugees in Europe.
But I was wondering, because the last survey about the refugees in Poland that numbers of people from Poland who supported refugees, 55% of the country residents, and 35% of them, they think they refugees should be citizens of neighboring countries such as Ukraine and Belarus. What does it indicate?
No, Poland is one of those countries that lost a lot of their own citizens who travel to the UK, who travel to Scandinavian countries, who travel to Germany, and Poland is in great need of migrants, of the migrant workforce. This is a situation not only in Poland but also in Central European countries, even in the Baltic states. Some countries, I don't remember which exactly, but after they joined the European Union and after the European Union opened the job market for them, some of those countries, they lost up to 30% of their workforce who just went to the West, to Western countries. So they of course need a workforce. And Ukrainians, especially in Central Eastern Europe, Ukrainians integrate more or less fast, especially in Poland, where you have similar culture, similar language. So they integrate fast. They fill in the jobs where there is shortage of people in Poland. So Ukrainian migrants actually play a very important role now in Poland's economy. And if some people are not happy about this, well, the situation would be worse without Ukrainian migrants.
Yes, I completely support your point, and I want to back to the right-wing party's popularity. In France, President Emmanuel Macron dissolved the National Assembly, and the reason is that party of Marine Le Pen won European Parliament election in the country. And to what extent does Le Pen currently depend on Russian influence? Because she had been receiving money from Moscow, we know it. But a few months ago, she condemned the Russian invasion.
Well, the National Front, that was the name of the party up until 2018. They received a bank loan from a Russian bank back in 2014 for the regional elections in 2015. There is no evidence that the National Front or the National Rally, as its new name in 2018, that they received any more support from the Russians, at least in these numbers, because that was 9 million euros, 9.4 million euros. But there is no evidence that they received any other substantial assistance. Marine Le Pen, she herself, she is not the same Le Pen as 10 years ago. She condemned the Russian invasion on the day when it happened, on the 24th of February 2022. She condemned this in unambiguous terms. It doesn't mean that she dramatically changed her opinions about foreign policy, but there is also no indication that she is going to go against mainstream positions on Ukraine and France. Macron's position about overwhelming support for Ukraine, it is a mainstream position, but there are other mainstream positions. For example, so in the opinion of Le Pen, Ukraine needs to be supported, but apparently they're not very eager about military support, right? So I don't know how this will change, because Macron stays as president, and foreign policy in France is dependent on president mostly. They have this very difficult time in it's called cohabitation in French, when the prime minister and president they belong to different political camps. So they will have this very difficult time, but at least major decisions will be taken by Macron. So mostly, if they form the government, if Rassemblement National Rally, if they form the government, it will mostly about domestic politics, and they will have their own huge problems. Indirectly, that could influence France's role in the EU. The problem essentially in the EU is that there are no leaders. There are these countries, there are big countries, there are smaller countries, but nobody is taking any lead. Macron was one of those leaders who, unlike many other French leaders, was happy to pose at the background of the European flag. But now he's in trouble back home, and that will surely undermine this leadership role that France has, and make things worse, so to say. But as for influence, getting back to your question, I don't think that Le Pen is, at least nowadays, somehow significantly influenced by the Kremlin. I can't even see what they can offer to her. She is very close to power in France. And France is economically just enormously bigger than Russia. The GDP of Russia is of ordinary European state. France is one of the leaders, economic leaders of the European Union. She's close to power. I don't think that. I can't imagine what influence the Kremlin can have on the probably even future leader of France.
Yeah, and what do you think about that figure of Viktor Orbán? Because for Ukrainians, that is like a wet blanket. Every time is he a vassal of Putin, or he's playing a Mokhenin game? And I wanted to ask you, how should Ukraine rebuild the relations with Hungary?
Well, Orbán's regime is really problematic on many levels. It's not only about its very subversive role that Hungary is playing now with this Russian invasion of Ukraine. Hungary blocks as many things as it can block. When it cannot block it, it starts complaining that it cannot block. Hungary is a country that is hugely dependent on the European Union for funding. Hugely dependent. And part of the success that Orbán has politically in his country is the economic stability. Is the economic stability and quite low costs of utilities for homes for ordinary people. Part of that success is dependent on Russian energy supplies. That have a political price. They are lower than the normal market prices because Orbán plays along. But for Orbán, it's really difficult to say why he's behaving the way he's behaving, but there is logic behind his behavior. It is his grip on power in Hungary, his willingness to keep that power as long as possible for him and his party. It's basically a mafia state. Yeah. And yeah, he's dependent on that funding, and he plays Russia against the EU and EU against Russia. He benefits economically from that blackmail, and what he's doing is blackmailing. Unfortunately, there is at the moment what Ukraine can do is to just follow the European line, and also deal with these Hungarian ethnic minorities. It's a big thing. Apparently, it's a big thing for Orbán's regime, and without moving forward in that direction, Hungary will not ease its problematic relations with Ukraine.
But could you imagine the situation when Hungary takes some part, annexes some part of Ukraine? Because we know a lot of people from that part of Ukraine who have Hungary passports, and the same was in Crimea. And we say, oh, that doesn't matter. But all in all, we have the very bad situation.
Well, Russia annexed Crimea. Russia annexed Crimea not because someone there had Russian passports. That was not the reason. Not the Russian passports. Hungary, I'm sure Orbán would be happy to take some parts of Ukraine if Ukraine collapses, right? But there is no, well, it's not very realistic that Ukraine collapses. But only in that case, Hungary would probably do something like this, or at least send some troops to enforce law and order. Because without the central government, if we're talking about the collapse of the state, people will need protection, and if there's no central power, parts of Ukraine will be opened for neighbors. I think that is actually that was the plan of Vladimir Putin. We know that through some channels they discussed this, or they tried to discuss this with Poland. Like, why don't you take parts of Western Ukraine?
Yep.
But we know that Poland declined, obviously, and said, of course not, we're not going to talk about this. But we don't know whether Orbán was actually interested in this. I'm sure that he was offered such an opportunity.
I wanted to ask you about the situation with attitude for Ukrainian right-wing forces, how it will change, because previously some big outlet media, they told horror stories about Azov and right sector. Are they no longer demonized them, or the Russian influence of propaganda still remains strong?
Well, the right sector is gone. I mean, this is not the topic. I don't think that it actually exists even in Ukraine. It was always a very strange movement. Too heterogeneous. There was two different people in there. As for Azov, it has become less problematic. This unit, although in some press, but mostly in the far left media, they would still talk about Azov and some other formations. But usually in the mainstream media, it doesn't have that. So the picture has changed. The reputation of Azov as a fighting unit has changed, especially after Mariupol, of course. So it's more or less fine now.
Okay, from your perspective, how will European Parliament elections affect to support for Ukraine? I mean, the weapon, of course. Will it be
the issue of
way?
Weapons, it's not decided by the European Parliament, really. Weapons, the issue of weapons, it's mostly decided by governments, by national governments. So I don't see that the European Parliament, the elections or the changes in the European Parliament will have any considerable effect on Ukraine.
Anything? They talk only about the situation with climate change and something else, not about the war.
They adopt resolutions which have a role of recommendations for national governments, but now also the European Commission, which is an executive branch of EU's power, their position will be important. But now we don't know yet who will be in charge of the European Commission. Most likely von der Leyen will stay, so things will stay the same. If she's not there, for some reason there will be a different president, it will be quite difficult then to understand what would be the impact of all this. But so far so good. So at the moment, I don't see any real challenges on the level of the European Parliament or the European Commission concerning Ukraine. I'm more concerned, much more concerned about the developments in France. They will have elections. Macron is playing a very, very risky game, and this can undermine the European effort. Yeah, this is despite the fact that Macron will remain in charge of the foreign policy of France. Still, it's a big thing. Maybe a very big change is coming up. Well, elections to European Parliament are generally less less popular among European citizens, unless we are talking about countries where vote is mandatory. For example, in Greece, it is mandatory to vote, to go and vote. But in the majority of other countries, people tend to go rather to national elections. They matter more for them than the European Parliament elections. Well, in Austria, at least in Austria, I've seen posters everywhere. So the campaigns were quite active, but I'm sure there will be a much more active campaign this autumn with the national elections in Austria.
Yes, to the end, I wanted to ask you about that conclusions that we can be drawn after the peace summit. What is supposed to finally bipolarize the world, or what is was the main objective of this peace summit?
Well, there is of course, there was an official agenda that was the discussion of Zelensky's peace formula. That was not very successful because only certain positions from that peace formula were discussed. Unofficially, I guess the objective of the peace summit was to secure support for Ukraine from so-called non-aligned countries, from the major powers of the so-called global south. China was, of course, a very important objective to get them on board. So this hasn't worked, unfortunately. But also, unfortunately, we don't see signatures for this declaration that was adopted by the peace summit from the countries such as India or Brazil, yeah, and maybe some other as well, also important African countries. So that was not exactly what can be called success, but what Zelensky started, what his office started with this peace summit and the formula. It's a very, very difficult process. It's a very long road to success. It was a good first step. It was an important step because this is the direction that Ukraine needs to go. Just needs to go. It has no other choice. But I think what can be improved is the more diplomatic work needs to be done, because Ukraine has ignored the countries of the global south since Ukraine became independent, since the 90s. Nobody really was bothered in Ukraine, in the diplomatic corps, about Ukraine's work in Latin America, about Ukraine's work in Africa, in Asia. I'm not even talking about China. Although there was actually an agreement in 2013, there was even a friendship declaration of friendship between China and Ukraine. But still, Ukraine has lost decades of building good contacts with countries of the global south. But now, better later than never. Ukraine needs to be much more active in this direction in this region of the world.
But you know that Ukraine have no official ambassador now in Poland, in London, and there there is very ridiculous situation, but we have not, unfortunately. I want to ask you, should Russia be involved in the second summit? Will it be beginning of the peace negotiating, or we will hear the proposal to give away for regions again in the best case scenario?
Whether Russia should be invited, this depends on what issues are going to be discussed at the next summit. This is one thing. Another thing is that Ukraine will, because this question about invitation for Russia, it will be, it's not just Ukraine's decision. It will depend whether Ukraine wants to have more involvement on the side of China or India, or other important players on the global arena. So territories, control over territories, that will be an issue that will be raised, of course. And Ukraine will need to respond to those questions. But as for, I don't think that this summit or the series of those summits, the series of those conferences, will be the main road to peace. I am sure, I'm 100% sure that everything will be decided not during those conferences, but on the battlefield. So the major objective for Ukraine is to win the war on the battlefield. Those conferences, they're good, they are important, but they're not the most important thing. The most important thing is the military victory.